Hello, and welcome to Grover Cleveland Week 2022. This is a full week set aside every year by the state to honor the only president born in the great state of New Jersey. The week includes Grover Cleveland's birthday, and this year would have been 185 years since he was born in Caldwell, New Jersey. My name is Louis Picone. I serve on the Board of Trustees for the Grover Cleveland Birthplace Memorial Association. I teach history at William Patterson University, and I'm the author of several books about the presidents, including The President is Dead, The Extraordinary Stories of the Presidential Deaths, Final Days, Burials, and Beyond, and Grant's Tomb, The Epic Death of Ulysses S. Grant and the Making of an American Pantheon. On March 18th, 1837, Grover Cleveland was born in this house in Caldwell, New Jersey. First opened to the public in 1913, the Grover Cleveland Birthplace historic site will be joined by another important institution on the property, dedicated to preserving and making available research materials documenting the public and private life of Grover Cleveland and First Lady Frances Folsom Cleveland. Today, I will be speaking to you about Grover Cleveland and a brief history of presidential libraries. On August 8th, 1885, several months after his election, President Grover Cleveland first met his predecessor, Rutherford B. Hayes, at Ulysses S. Grant's funeral in New York City. Hayes recorded his impression of President Grover Cleveland in his diary. I found him plain, sensible, natural, in all respects well appearing. His talk was friendly and assuring, but he lacks experience, is not a great man. But he intends and anxiously wishes to do well. And here you see Grover Cleveland standing beside the coffin of Ulysses S. Grant as it's being carried inside of his temporary crypt. Now, 2 years later, in 1887, Grover Cleveland, who had long since dispelled concerns that he lacked experience, was visited in the White House by James Roosevelt, a wealthy New York political ally and supporter. Over the years, the two had formed a friendship, and James had visited the president several times. But on this day, he was accompanied by his 5-year-old son. The robust Grover Cleveland must have made an imposing sight. But always at ease with children, his friendly demeanor surely put the youngster at ease as well. Now, the president took the boy's small hand in his, looked him in the eye, and told him, "My little man, I am making a strange request of you. It is that you will never be president of the United States of America." Now, while Grover Cleveland's advice was usually sound and wise to follow, had the young Franklin D. Roosevelt listened to him that day, American history and world history would have been much different. Now, these two interesting but seemingly random encounters introduced Grover Cleveland to the two presidents who could both rightfully claim the first presidential library in their honor. Soon the newest will be the Grover Cleveland Presidential Library and Museum at his birthplace in Caldwell, New Jersey. But first, let me explain how two presidents both started America's presidential library system. First, let's start with Franklin Roosevelt. In the 1930s, in the middle of his second term, FDR proposed building a library to store his personal and presidential papers and memorabilia, including official gifts that he'd been given and his model ship collection. This was a momentous decision, as no previous president had sought to preserve their papers for public access. This also aligned with FDR's belief in government transparency and the people's right to know what their president was doing. In 1939, construction began on FDR's presidential library on his Hyde Park, New York estate, also happened to be where he was born. Now, the presidential library was not only FDR's idea, but he also participated in the project, including designing the building. The next year, he donated the presidential library to the National Archives and Records Administration. Now, FDR continued to use his library during his presidency, including recording several of his fireside chats there. Of the 13 presidential libraries run by the federal government to date, FDR's remains the only one to be used during his presidency. But what exactly is a presidential library? Well, for starters, It's a uniquely American idea, as no other countries can boast a similar institution. The National Archives explains, presidential libraries are archives and museums, bringing together the documents and artifacts of a president and his administration and presenting them to the public for study and discussion without regard to political considerations or affiliations. Now, following FDR's lead, the Presidential Library became a standard for all future presidents, as well as FDR's only living predecessor at the time, Herbert Hoover. As perhaps an unattended benefit, they also kept the former presidents busy and gave their years out of Washington additional significance. Now, the problem of life as a former president was something that Grover Cleveland pondered. In later life, he wrote, "Something ought to be done. As of now, nothing seems to be dignified enough for them." Now, there was Benjamin Harrison. He went into law. The first time he got up to argue a case in court, everybody laughed. I know how it is. I went back to law myself when I left Washington for the first time. I walked into the Supreme Court, and there on the bench sat two judges that I had appointed myself. No, it doesn't do. So a fellow has to remain a loafer all the rest of his life simply because he happened to be president? It ain't right. It isn't fair. Now, each presidential library under the National Archives is unique, educational, and fascinating in their own way. I've been to them all, and the one that stands out in particular is Ronald Reagan's in Simi Valley, California. There, one can board the same Air Force One presidential airplane that Reagan used during his administration. Also, you can enjoy a pint at an authentic Irish pub that Reagan had visited while touring the country of his ancestors. Years later, learning that it was closing, the Reagan Presidential Library purchased the tavern, disassembled it, and rebuilt it within the Presidential Library. But what about those presidents who served before Hoover? Well, that's where Rutherford B. Hayes comes in, because his presidential library, also like FDR on his estate in Spiegel Grove, Ohio, opened a quarter century before Roosevelt's. The Hayes Presidential Library was dedicated on Memorial Day 1916. According to their website, the library preserved President Hayes's personal library along with archival material from his military and political career, particularly his presidency. The Rutherford B. Hayes's Presidential Library is run by a nonprofit entity funded by the Rutherford B. Hayes Lucy Webb Hayes Foundation in the state of Ohio. Unlike the Presidential Library started under FDR, Hayes's receives no federal funds and is not part of the federal system of presidential libraries. Now, the Hayes Presidential Library ushered in a less uniform, ever-expanding system of presidential libraries established to honor the legacy of America's earlier presidents, run by a variety of entities. These libraries include the James Monroe Museum and Memorial Library, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, and the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library, located, just like Cleveland's will be, at his birthplace in Stanton, Virginia. Like those under the National Archives, they will also serve as museums and archive repositories. Although, since many of the earlier presidents did not preserve their official papers, the archives are generally less extensive. One of the most memorable for me was an animatronic president and first lady at the William McKinley Presidential Library and Museum in Canton, Ohio. It is in this second category which Grover Cleveland will soon become the latest to join the pantheon of presidential libraries. The Grover Cleveland Presidential Library and Museum will be a source of both local pride and national significance. Grover Cleveland was a champion of honest government, and his campaign slogan and political guiding principle was, "A public office is a public trust." Like the man of honors, it will, at least at the onset, be modest. You will not find a presidential airplane, a transported tavern from Buffalo, or at least in the near future, an animatronic Grover Cleveland, although that would be pretty cool. It will, however, feature a museum, research facilities, and a good citizenship learning lab. In addition to the physical location, the Grover Cleveland Presidential Library will also have a digital presence. As of now, an opening date has still not been set, so stay tuned. But to keep up on the latest information for the Grover Cleveland Presidential Library and Museum, check out www.groverclevelandpresidentiallibrary.org. And for more information on the Grover Cleveland Birthplace Memorial Association, check out www.presidentcleveland.org. Now, thank you, and I hope you enjoy Grover Cleveland Week.